Good morning. Being from New York, it will be difficult to not speak so quickly, but I will do my best. Thank you for the introduction, Guillaume. I want to say, first of all, that yes, I am a professor of archaeology and trained as an archaeologist. In the U.S., archaeology is almost always within departments of anthropology, and so that actually is the lens when you hear me talk about heritage. I'm always thinking as an anthropologist. I'm thinking about culture first and foremost. I'm also the founding director of the Center for Heritage and Society, and I will give a shameless plug to say that we are hosting a conference ourselves on cultural landscapes and heritage values, and I've left some cards out in the foyer. And we also publish a journal, Heritage and Society, and I want to invite all of the presenters, if you think you have research or colleagues that touch on aspects of heritage and society. We would love to have more papers. We publish our abstracts in French and Spanish, even though the articles themselves are in English. So I want to talk today about the research agenda of the Center for Heritage and Society, and also provide a case study from the Bahamas as a way to illustrate the potential of such an agenda. I want to make sure I have my... So I can still start, and then my slides can catch up to me. So in recent years, it's become clear that heritage impacts all aspects of society and, in fact, shapes how individuals define themselves in the world. In imagining and planning economic development, cultural heritage, certainly in the U.S., is usually viewed as an impediment to progress and change, rather than a pathway to a better future. But heritage affects how people understand scientific knowledge, how they adopt technology and technological change, and it also affects their attachments to place and to one another. There's a great need for a major research agenda that will ask some of the most pressing questions in our increasingly globalized and diasporic world. For example, what do societies choose to remember? What do they choose to forget? And perhaps most importantly, who gets to decide? And what impact does it have? Something that I also want to highlight is something that's been brought up many times already, which is that heritage values, by definition, change in order for them to be relevant to contemporary society. And so when we're thinking about heritage conservation and management, how is it that we safeguard change as we undertake this work? The study of heritage itself is not centered on any one discipline or field, and it touches many. One of the things that was important when I founded the center at UMass was that we included natural science scholars as well as social science and humanities scholars. So the study of heritage is thus not centered on any one discipline or field, and really requires interdisciplinary and perhaps even transdisciplinary theory and method. So cultural heritage, as I'm defining it here, is the full range of inherited traditions and monuments, objects, living environments, and most importantly, the range of contemporary activities and meanings that are drawn from these things. It includes, of course, we've been talking about both, this is actually a picture of the Bahamas. There you go. Imagine a place very warm today. So my questions, how do we safeguard change? And then heritage as transdisciplinary, and these are most of the departments at the university that have been involved in our center, and it's been very enlightening to try to work across these fields and across different disciplines and really ways of knowing different pedagogies and epistemologies. So heritage, as I've just defined, is really all of the traditions and monuments and objects, but the range of contemporary activities. So in particular, in my center, we are studying people's behaviors in the present. And so as such, we really are defining heritage studies as a social science. We involve humanities scholars, we involve natural science scholars, public health professionals, but the way that we have thought of the research agenda is really a social science research agenda. In particular, I want to share with you 3 themes that we believe are some of the highest priority areas for the study of heritage and society. Which includes both tangible and intangible heritage, which we've touched on so far here, but also highlights the inextricability of the tangible and the intangible, so that all tangible objects only have value because we have intangible values that we bestow on them, and likewise, intangible heritage almost always has some tangible products. They just may not be quite as old as some of the tangible heritage that we define as such. In the United States, anyway, the study of the past has largely been the domain of the historiographical fields of archaeology and history. And while the application of these fields, as found in historic preservation and cultural resource management, will always be important, there's really a critical need for the formation of a scientific research agenda and capacity building in this field of heritage studies, as I've defined it as a social science of the past. So these are the 3 themes that I'd like to touch on today that I think really form the core of the research agenda as we've defined it at the Center for Heritage and Society, identity, ecology, and health, with heritage overlapping all 3 of these things. So first of all, in terms of identity, one of the major questions that guides this research agenda is how cultural heritage can be used as a tool for understanding cultural difference and strengthening individual and community identity in this increasingly globalized, mobile, multicultural, and diasporic world. International development agencies and international organizations take it as a given that the promotion of cultural heritage monuments and landscapes increases social cohesion by enhancing feelings of local identity and place attachment. But these assertions have not been rigorously tested or even adequately defined in social scientific terms. In what ways do the conservation and commemoration of the artifacts of heritage affect the sense of security or feelings of social inclusion among individuals and communities? So we sort of set out as a primary hypothesis. We sent in a research agenda to the National Science Foundation. One of our primary hypotheses was that cultural heritage policies, inclusive cultural heritage policies, that is, those accepting divergent cultural attitudes and values and encouraging all sectors, stakeholders, and communities to participate in heritage planning and commemoration, will have a positive societal effect. Second, ecology. Communities, towns, and governments typically disassociate cultural historical resources from natural resources. This is this culture-nature divide, something that we're really going to focus quite a bit on. And even though many here have, in fact, terroir itself emphasizes the inability to disassociate the cultural and the natural, the second major hypothesis of this research agenda is that cultural heritage is the key to a sustainable relationship between humans and their natural environments. Climate change will result in accelerated changes for human communities, from dislocation to a change in the physical manifestations of place. As Eric Orsena reminded us yesterday, there are already very serious food shortages and access issues worldwide. New approaches to contemporary medicine and sustainable agriculture practices have come out of the heritage fields of ethnobotany, traditional medicine, and traditional agriculture. These practices and knowledge bases can be brought to bear on the problems of changing ecosystems and the demand for sustainable development practices, healthy ecosystems, and food security. One of the underexplored impacts of climate change is its effects on social identity and place attachment. Human connection to the landscape will change when favorite and indicator species die off, as is happening in many parts of the world. As ecosystems shift, impacts will be seen across a wide range of scales, from the mega region to the local site, and the resulting dislocation and social change has the potential to destabilize society. Finding ways to mitigate that outcome is a major focus of this research theme. Third, health. The public health research community in the US has recently begun to focus on the role of social and historical determinants to explain health inequalities among marginalized people. So the third and final major hypothesis of this research agenda is that heritage plays a major role in both the mental and physical wellness of individuals and communities. This perspective highlights the impact of things such as discrimination, institutional structures, unfair economic practices in the production and maintenance of health disparities. Much of the research, previous research, has narrowly defined these social structures in terms of time and space, neglecting the potentially rich contributions of heritage studies. In this burgeoning public health field, research is needed to explore how one's understandings of selfhood and home, or homeland, influence personal and community health in direct and subtle ways. Issues such as acculturation stress, historical loss of cultural resources, and the effects of rapid social change have been linked to negative health outcomes in some communities. More indirectly, ideas of heritage situate members of groups in particular ways that can have real health and economic implications. Conversely, positive social and health outcomes have been associated with cultural identity, continuity, and engagement. And heritage studies is in a unique position to deepen this critical research area, and in so doing, can provide much needed insight into the connections among culture, identity, ecology, and health. So in addition to these three overarching themes, that's okay. Yeah, okay, okay. In addition to these three areas, these overarching themes, there are areas that cut across all heritage work in terms of methodological and topical needs. In the interest of time, I will not say too much about information technology. It was the focus of one of our annual conferences at the center, and the idea is that we increasingly use information technology to present the results of heritage work, and we also rely on information technology to connect communities to place when they are far away at a distance. And the question is how information technology has changed our views of the past. What impact does having 3D reconstructions of ancient cities or places, what impact do information technologies have, and how can they assist us in historic preservation and presentation? And then, of course, the primary focus, or one of the primary foci of this conference, economics and valuation. The understanding of the economic impacts of heritage, from tourism to social cohesion, are really underdeveloped. I was talking with David earlier about how difficult it has been to get the economists interested at my university in any event, in thinking about how we, using qualitative measures and quantitative measures, how it is we can look at the economics of something like social cohesion or wellness. What are the economic impacts of positive public health outcomes related to cultural heritage? So some of the central questions within economics, at least from a heritage studies perspective, include, are the monuments and traditions of the past equally beneficial resources for all levels of local economies? How do we develop an index of economic benefit beyond tourism for heritage development? And what are the hidden costs of heritage tourism to a community? And is the investment return ratio for heritage development sustainable? And if so, under what circumstances? One of the things I wanted to mention that has been certainly important in the US and has been an emphasis of our center is the movement away from the heritage professional as the sole objective expert. Meaning that community engagement includes learning from the community what is going to be the most sustainable in that local context. Because we have found, certainly, and I'm sure all of you have found, that in some contexts there are sustainable heritage practices, and in other contexts a different approach is needed. So community engagement is really critical. And the impact of listening to communities and learning from communities in a multi-directional way is really critical. So Isabel asked me to provide a case study for some of the principles and research questions that I have laid out. And so as an example of a region that may on its face seem quite different environmentally and culturally from what we've been discussing thus far, I do think there are very similar issues that are faced in any community that tries to undertake heritage development in terms of both social and economic development. So I would like to bring us to the Bahamas and to the island of Eleuthera. If you look in the bottom right-hand corner of the larger map there, right above the word Nassau is where the island of Eleuthera sits. It is 70 miles off of the coast of Florida. And the Bahamas includes 29 islands and 661 keys, or small islands, some of them inhabited and some of them not. The earliest inhabitants of the Bahamas were the Taino, who appear in the archaeological record about 600 AD, followed by their descendants, the Lucayan. And the Lucayan were short-range mariners living in small coastal villages where they subsisted on limited agricultural-based, primarily on manioc cultivation and other natural resources of the sea. The Lucayan were among the first indigenous groups to be directly encountered by Europeans. They first encountered the Spanish, followed by the French, Danish, Dutch, and English. The geographical position of the Bahamas was advantageous to any colonial power investing in maintaining a presence in the Caribbean. Initially, the Spanish claimed the Bahamas, but it was short-lived, and they eventually abandoned all attempts to set up a permanent colony among the scattered islands. As you can see, I included the satellite image here to show you just how shallow it is between the islands. When you fly by plane from Nassau to Eleuthera, most of the time you can see the bottom of the Caribbean as you're flying just above. The most, let's see, The Bahamas became a British colony in 1718, and many different segments of British colonists and subjects settled in the Bahamas. The most transformative moment in the settling of the Bahamas was the resettlement of American loyalists just after the Treaty of Versailles. Upwards of 100,000 refugees, mostly from the southern United States, were relocated and given large parcels of land following the American Revolution. The mostly American-born loyalists brought to the Bahamas, in captivity, a large population of Creole-born Africans with the intention of establishing a cotton plantation economy in the Bahamas. Following a brief period of prosperity, the cotton plantation economy failed in 1800, attributed to poor soil quality, an unforgiving terrain, and multiple insect attacks. Many plantations cleared the land, experimented with sugar production and salt raking, and utilized mixed farming strategies in order to survive into the early 19th century. However, most of these plantations were poverty-stricken, and the activities of the plantation owners and captive African people focused primarily on subsistence activities. Skipping to the most recent history, the Bahamas became an independent commonwealth in 1973. Many farms closed, the international airport closed, and there has been far less consistent tourism since then. Overall, the economy is quite stagnant, and tourism is viewed by many as the only viable answer to Eleuthera's economic problems. So the Center for Heritage and Society has begun a community heritage project on Eleuthera. And I hasten to stress the fact that we did not seek out this project. We were approached by a local community development organization called the One Eleuthera Foundation. And they reached out to us 2 and 3 times before we decided to initiate a potential collaboration. One might ask, why would you not want to undertake a project in the Bahamas? It's a very beautiful location, as I will show you briefly. But initially, I was concerned that their reaching out to us was motivated by wanting to increase tourism to the island as a sort of panacea for economic problems and social problems. And once we were able to meet, and I was able to explain that we were interested in research about some of the best practices in thinking about long-term, sustainable social and economic development together, they became even more excited about the opportunity to work together. Because as you can imagine, how many of you have been to the Bahamas? Anyone? Okay. Vacation? Vacation? Right. In the US, there's a great commercial that says, "It's better in the Bahamas." That's the tagline. And you see sandy beaches, and you see wealthy people sipping champagne on the beach, and resort hotels, and easy, life is easy. And this has been the major ad campaign. But as many of you probably know, if you've been to Nassau, there's also really rampant mass tourism that has destroyed many of these islands' fragile ecosystems. Some of the larger islands start to all look the same with the same hotel chains. A lot of the children, when they reach early adulthood, leave the island because they feel there's really nothing there for them. And so the people of Eleuthera knew that they wanted economic development, but they also knew what they did not want. And they did not want to look like Nassau or Grand Bahama, or what in the US we call the spring break islands, where all the college students go to wreak havoc on their spring break. So they knew what they didn't want, but they were not exactly sure what they did want. But they felt that somehow heritage was the key to something that would be more sustainable than what they had witnessed elsewhere. Just as a quick example, in Nassau, I am told that the hotels are built to last for 5 years. They are built, they are filled with tourists, they are torn down 5 years later. Someone else buys the property, builds another hotel, 5 years, and they tear it down again. You can imagine what this does both to the sometimes these hotel chains bring in their own workers also from other countries. And so even the workers in the hotels changes every 5 years. This is what they did not want. So let me just go back a second. So when the Center for Heritage and Society began to undertake a project with the people of Eleuthera, the first thing we did was to go down to assess all of the heritage resources, the tangible heritage resources, the intangible, to get a sense of the broad range of heritage there. The island is very rich in built heritage. It houses in this yellow house here what is said to have been the first parliament of the Bahamas. But it is also, some of the historic areas are ravaged by hurricanes almost every year. And so even though it has a rich tangible heritage and built heritage, a lot of that has sustained some storm damage. And so we were able to take an inventory of some of the historic structures and note that a real systematic inventory and a study of the unique vernacular architecture was needed. The island is also rich in archaeological resources. There are a number of limestone caves at the north end of the island. Here's an example of one of these caves, where excavations revealed a pre-contact indigenous occupation, and it's highly probable that a systematic archaeological survey of the other sectors of the island, which is 120 miles long, would reveal a rich archaeological record. There has never been a systematic archaeological study of the island. There is also a plantation, the ruins of a plantation at the south end of the island from the 18th and 19th century. And this plantation was originally 5,000 acres. The main core of this plantation is 2,000 acres. And likewise, the plantation, there is no existing map of the plantation and no archaeological or historical study. And it stands out as particularly important in Eleuthera's history. It's reported to have been the first port of entry for enslaved Africans bound ultimately for the US, and later the site of the importation of the US plantation system. And it offers a unique site for the study of the material culture of this stage of the slave trade, and it may be likely to reveal transplanted African traditions and material culture that was subsequently lost or at least hidden through the process of deculturation on the American mainland. The location of the site also offers good potential for community involvement in the archaeological work and its interpretation to visitors. Princess Cruise Lines has a port very near this plantation, and they have wanted to have ATV, all-terrain vehicles taking tours up to the old plantation. And Right now, the local community would like to exploit the potential economic benefit of working with Princess Cruise Line. But on the other hand, they're also very worried both about the fragile ecosystem and what stories would be told and the impacts on the community. Another important heritage resource is the remains of changing agricultural methods on the island over the centuries, and especially in the era of large-scale agriculture in the 20th century. These conspicuous ruined silos at Hatchet Bay represent a period of intense food production on the island that today is forgotten or unknown to many of the younger generation, especially because of the association of farming with slavery and British rule. So when I was taking a tour of the island, I asked, what are these structures? They're completely abandoned as you drive down the road. And my tour guide said, oh, don't worry, those aren't condos or anything. And I said, well, what are they? He said, they're silos from the 1970s. And so after the Bahamas and Eleuthera got its independence, a lot of the British agricultural activity completely ceased, and these silos lay completely abandoned. Apparently there was beef production, large-scale pineapple production, and a number of other agricultural products. And today there's very little food grown on the island. So that's a bit of a survey of the tangible heritage. In terms of intangible, there is an annual tradition called Junkanoo, which is a festival with music and dancing, you can see in the lower left, with very elaborate costumes. But with the exception of the Junkanoo festival, the intangible heritage remains largely unknown. The Junkanoo festivals are often used for tourism, but much of the other traditions and foodways and knowledge and skills are known only to local residents and are passed down through family traditions and oral history. Eleuthera's intangible heritage is in as much danger of disappearing as some of its built and archaeological heritage. And the challenge is not only to remember, however, but to incorporate the past into Eleuthera's constantly evolving cultural identity. Eleuthera is also blessed with a beautiful natural heritage, and the natural environment is obviously a very important part of the overall sustainability plan. Island ecosystems are particularly fragile, and Eleuthera is really only accessible by small airplane and small boats. There is very little boat traffic to and from the island. Given that the highest point on the island is 200 feet above sea level, or 60 meters above sea level, and given that nearly every aspect of the island's heritage is tied to the sea, major sea level rise and the increased risk of damaging storms puts Eleuthera in a precarious position vis-a-vis the sustainability of cultural heritage. So the UMass Center for Heritage and Society has begun a project with the people of Eleuthera, and we've undertaken a large-scale inventory of the tangible and intangible heritage resources, and we've undertaken a couple of projects that were specifically asked for by the people of Eleuthera and the foundation that we're working with. First of all, the first thing they asked us for was an online web portal. Now you may say, what does a website have to do with cultural heritage? But the organization lacked the capacity to think about ways to use information technology to increase cooperation among both communities on the island and communities that are off the island, maybe working at some of the other islands in the Bahamas. So we created an online central information portal for the One Eleuthera Foundation in order to present information to various publics and to help the community organizations manage their constituent and development data. Another project that we took on was a historic building inventory in the main town of Governor's Harbor that has the largest number of standing historic buildings. They felt that they wanted to be able to determine opportunities for fundraising and historic preservation, and wanted an outside view of the historic potential of some of these areas. So we undertook a mapping and historic research, as well as taking interviews of oral histories of the uses of some of these buildings. Also planned is the mapping, excavation, and oral history of the Miller's Plantation that I mentioned earlier. And I'm working with archaeologist Professor Battle Baptiste at UMass, and she is undertaking a large-scale survey and excavation of the main 2,000 acres of the plantation. The excavation at Miller's is really important because one of my colleagues called archaeology performative history, in that by excavating the plantation and inviting the community to participate in the excavation allows them to connect their oral history with a very tangible history and take ownership of what is a difficult and dark past for enslaved Africans. There's been a rejection of discussing the history of enslavement, but it's difficult to know where to go in your future if you are not connected to your past. That is the major premise on the project, that a deep connection and embracing of even difficult pasts is the key to a sustainable future. So to conclude, unlike other islands in the Bahamas and in the Caribbean that have succumbed to the homogenization and environmental degradation, Eleuthera maintains much of its natural and cultural heritage, and it does provide an important comparative example of the importance of terroir or locally based economies for sustainability. And of course, it adds the complexities of diasporic heritage to our conversations over these days, because of course, enslaved Africans did not come on their own volition, but these families have been there for 400 years, and so this is the heritage that they are now tied to. I would like to end by sharing the perspective of my colleague, Rodney Harrison, who characterizes heritage as caring for and attending to the past in the present. As he puts it, heritage functions towards assembling futures, and thus might be more productively connected with other pressing social, economic, political, and ecological issues of our time. So thank you very much for your attention.